Welcome. Good evening, everyone. I'm Niharika Mumtaz. As the founder of Bangash Art Week, it's our humble effort to bring together a group of extremely talented women leaders involved in the art industry in various capacities to hear their stories and celebrate their success. We still live in a world where there are inequalities in the way women are paid, encouraged, and promoted. In the current pandemic, women have been disproportionately impacted, having to juggle domestic life with motherhood, homeschooling, as well as their careers. For women in the arts negotiating freelance careers, this has resulted in a double whammy, leaving them with limited choices, having to put everyone else first their families, their children, their partners. Yet, despite these current and historic challenges, women have continued to emerge as leaders, shaping our educational, cultural, and creative landscape. They have changed lives and impacted millions. Today, we will hear their own stories, their extraordinary journeys, and learn about the challenges they faced and the sacrifices they had to make, which ultimately led their rise from the ashes like a phoenix. I'm certain that these stories will inspire millions more and empower more women to believe in themselves. Bangladesh Art Week would like to continue to conduct this kind of international talk shows more to highlight the success of women and tackle the challenges they face. Without further ado, I would now hand over the floor to Uthra Rajgopal to moderate the show. She is an independent curator with a specialist interest in South Asian textiles and textile arts. Formerly at the Whitworth, Uthra has a particular interest in working with South Asian artists and the diaspora. She recently helped to build a new collection representing these artists for the Whitworth. Uthra has worked with a number of museum dress, textile collections, commercial archives, and exhibitions. Please welcome Uthra Rajgopal.
Thank you so much. Thank
Welcome,
you,
Uthra.
Niharika. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who has tuned in and who is listening. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you, Niharika, for inviting me to moderate this talk on this important day today. I'm very much looking forward to it. And
Yeah, we're really honored and excited to have you all and all of our distinguished speakers with us today to celebrate International Women's Day together. So thank you again, Anutra. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Niharika. And once again, a warm welcome to all of you. It's my great pleasure to be here today and to introduce to you the esteemed panel that we have for you today. First up is Professor Mrs. Salima Hashmi, who is an artist, a curator, and an art historian, although she also likes the title troublemaker. For those of you who know Mrs. Hashmi, you will know that she has had a long-standing involvement in the promotion, development, and the shaping of art education and cultural development, particularly in Pakistan. Professor Hashmi was the founding dean of the Mariam Darwood School of Visual Art and Design at Beacon House National University in Lahore and was the professor of fine art at the National College of Arts in Lahore and was also the former principal there. She has written many, many books, but it's fair to say that her latest books concentrate on contemporary art from Pakistan, focusing on women artists, and they include Memories, Myths and Mutations, Contemporary Art of India and Pakistan, co-authored with Yashodhara Dalmia for Oxford University Press 2006, and The Eye Still Seeks, Contemporary Art of Pakistan for Penguin in 2014. And most importantly, she is a council member for the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan and a founder member of Women's Action Forum. Welcome, Mrs. Hashmi.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. And the next person I would like to introduce to the panel is the London-based artist Rana Begum. I beg your pardon. Rana can be described as an artist with many, many dimensions to her artwork. She distills spatial and visual experience into ordered form. Through her refined language of minimalist abstraction, Rana Begum blurs the boundaries between sculpture, painting, and architecture. Her visual language draws from the urban landscape as well as geometric patterns from traditional Islamic art and architecture. And those of you who are familiar with Rana's work will know that light is fundamental to her process. And Rana Begum absorbs and reflects the varied destinies of light to produce an experience for the viewer that is both temporal and sensorial. Rana has exhibited all over the world, too many to mention here, but I suppose I should mention that her forthcoming exhibitions are this year's Kate McGarry 2021, the Mead Gallery next year, and at the New Art Centre in 2023. Welcome, Rana Begum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. It's lovely to have you here. And our next panelist is Dr. Zehra Jumabhoy, a UK-based art historian, curator, and writer specializing in modern and contemporary South Asian art and its diasporas. She was the Stephen and Elena Hines Scholar at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, where she completed her doctorate and subsequently lectured on undergraduate and postgraduate programs. She is now a visiting lecturer at various academic institutions in the UK, India, Pakistan, and Singapore, and is currently teaching on 2 MA programs dedicated to contemporary Asian art and theory at Sotheby's Institute of Art and LaSalle College of Arts in Singapore. And she's also working with Head of Exhibitions Katie Freer at the Glyn Vivian Art Gallery in Swansea as a research curator funded by the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art on a major exhibition for 2022 called Imperial Subjects (Post-Colonial Conversations Between South Asia and Britain). Welcome, Zehra.
Hello.
Hello.
And finally, I would like to introduce Lita Albuquerque, who is an internationally renowned multidisciplinary artist and writer. She has developed a visual language that brings the realities of time and space to a human scale and is acclaimed for her ephemeral and permanent artworks executed in the landscape and public sites. Lita is actually joining us live from California, where it's very, very early. But before she appears on your screen, I will just quickly let you know that she was raised in, she was born in Santa Monica, raised in Tunisia, North Africa, and Paris. In the 70s, she emerged on the California art scene as part of the light and space movement and won acclaim for her epic and poetic ephemeral pigment pieces created for desert sites. Welcome, Lita.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
So I thought we would begin our conversation Um, Seeing as that we've all been brought together to this space to celebrate International Women's Day as part of Bangladesh Art Week, to talk about and share our experiences as women as to how we have negotiated our careers in the arts. And I wondered if Mrs. Hashmi, you might like to take that question first.
Well, yes, since I'm the most ancient person on this panel, I'm going back to the last century, no less. Well, really, I think of the time when I was interviewing one of my old teachers, Anna Molka Ahmed, who was in fact the first founding head of department at the Punjab University of the Fine Arts Department. And she told me this lovely story of how when she was being interviewed for that post, it was, setting up the department. And at the end of her thing, they told her, okay, you've got it. And as she was getting up to go, the vice chancellor said, by the way, you know that there'll only be female students in the fine art department, and quite taken aback. So she said, why? And said, well, because, we are setting up this department because we find that female students are cluttering up the more important departments of physics and chemistry and mathematics and all the rest of it. So we thought that we'd give them this for themselves. This is during the British period. So it gives you a little bit of an insight into what the British thought about art, one of those frivolous things on the periphery which can be left to women. Well, it was left to women for the first 11 years. And then they finally allowed male students. But by that time, it so happened that it was a little too late. The women were in control. And in fact, that has been the story of Pakistani academic art programs that had been largely in the hands of women, but not the professional field. So the women were the teachers, and these bohemian, hard-drinking men, they were the artists. They did all the things that were, beyond polite society. But I think that I have seen in my lifetime, that in the most difficult of times, for example, during the dictatorship of General Ziaul Haq, when, all voices were silenced, political parties were banned, the poets had, silenced themselves. It was the women's movement that took off. And it was the women's movement in the arts. There were women lawyers, there were women poets, feminist poets, and there were women artists. And they were doing all the kind of work which was, taboo, because the state was promoting landscape and calligraphy. It was acceptable. But women were doing things like, speaking for myself, the unclothed body, challenging, if you like, the narrative of what art should be about. One saw abusive new laws which aimed to take on ownership of the body. The state was going to decide, if there was going to be a rape case, the woman had to produce 4 male witnesses before she could bring a case of rape, and so on and so forth. So women started working, women artists started working on topics that were taboo, on giving voice, if you to various forms of the arts. And so I think that we have seen a sea change. And today you find women artists from Pakistan in all the fields that are possibly there. They led the way in contemporary miniature, people like Shazia Sikandar and Ayesha Khaled, and, Nusra Latif Qureshi and Talha Rathore. And I'm not, de-recognizing the males, but certainly the women led the way in difficult times, as I think they continue to do. And thinking back to the time of Anna Molka Ahmed, and having been through the time when I was one of the only 4 students at the National College of Arts, for 4 female students, and looking at the large number of female artists now, it's been quite a journey. it's been quite a journey.
That's amazing. And it's really fantastic to hear how you and those around you at the time were real pioneers in pushing forward and creating this space for women artists to not only be represented, but also to have the power to speak about issues that hit them so profoundly. And it feels like that space that was created for art really opened up conversations in a way that they otherwise would not have had the opportunity to have had and negotiated, and that's it's really important as well what you said about the artists coming through today, that we recognize their work, and we sort of, you know, we all kind of stand on each other's shoulders in a way. It's because of the pioneering work that you all did that other women artists can come forward today. I just wanted to ask Rana Begum about your experience in negotiating your journey through the arts, having been born in Bangladesh, and you're a London-based artist, and what cultural barriers you have faced in forging that career for yourself.
Thank you. I think for me, it came through wanting kind of independence, having seen my aunts and cousins and mum and sisters kind of, I guess, fight for their kind of independence and kind of views to be heard. I feel like I naturally had that that kind of approach growing up in a household of siblings. You know, there's 5 of us, 2 brothers and 3 girls. So I think, and the brothers were closer in age. So I kind of naturally kind of always looked at kind of, you know, if they weren't doing kind of household stuff, then I wouldn't be doing, you know, if they were getting education, then I wanted to get the education. And I think for my parents, it wasn't, I know that it wasn't an easy journey, you know, for them bringing us over to the UK. I remember my mum actually wanting to learn English, my father wanting to support her. And then when she did start English classes, you know, the community started talking. And so immediately she has to withdraw from the English classes. And I saw the effect of that. I saw the long-term effect of that. So I think, you know, I had that strength from my family, but I had to find it, you know, take that journey in a way that was kind of still respectful for them, and that I wasn't losing my identity. I wasn't losing my cultural identity or the religion. And I really struggled with that, because immediately, you know, you're seen as, especially when you do work that is abstract and colorful, you know, there is an immediate need for people to kind of pigeonhole you. It's like, oh, okay, you know, you can fit in that Islamic art kind of category or miniature, or, you know. And so I remember actually having to make a conscious decision about, actually, no, that won't be the forefront of how I have a conversation about my work. I remember having to kind of pull that back and actually focus on the other aspect of my work. And it's only now that I feel quite confident about saying, okay, there is this aspect in my work. There is an influence, a strong influence from the Islamic art and architecture, without feeling like I would be put in a box. And I think that was quite, I mean, I kind of surprised looking back how I managed to kind of navigate that journey. I think it is so easy, like Salima is saying, it's so easy to put people in a box. It's so easy to put female artists in a box. And I don't think we would be where we are if it wasn't for people like Salima, who had set precedent for us to be able to kind of stand up and say, no, this is what I want to focus. This is what my concerns are currently. Yeah, I think it's, yeah.
Can I just pick up on one thing? So Salima Hashmi was talking about her work referencing the unclothed female body. And you've talked about light and the influence of architecture, etc., in your work. If you had produced work referencing the nude, the female, unclothed female body, do you think you would have received a different reaction to your work? Do you think, could you quickly comment on that, or is that?
Yeah, no, I can actually. I'm glad, because you kind of reminded me of a kind of early stage. So I did actually start off as a figurative artist. I was really interested in that. But I found it really difficult to explain to my parents the interest. And so I used to continue doing it, but I would hide it all. So I didn't really show any of that body of work. But that was very early stage. That was before I'd even, before I even understood what it was that I was interested in. So I think it would, I don't know, I mean, I feel like it's much more open now. It's much more accepting. And I think especially if you can communicate it, I think that is necessary to be able to put words, with the images. I think that's important. But I don't know, it's quite hard to say, but someone like Shazia Sikandar, she's doing incredibly well as a figurative artist, and it's great to be able to see that that being pushed, that we're not stuck in the past, we're not still creating the same, that we're actually building on top of what we're, on top of the past, we're building on top of what we've learned. And I think that's what someone like Shazia Sikandar is doing really successfully.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and really interesting to hear about your early experiences of working with figurative art. And I just wanted to ask Zehra Jumabhoy now for her input on how she has perceived these agendas, these issues that women have faced historically and in modern day society today, being an art historian with a specialist interest in South Asian modern and contemporary art. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about your insights into this idea of figurative work and how women have had to negotiate that.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I love the sort of drawing Rana on that as well. I think one of the things I want to say is that sort of art history in the UK is in a slightly the sort of the dialogue is different from being an artist in many senses, and one of that is because of the sort of trying to position a South Asian art history within within academic art history that doesn't necessarily know how to account for it, or it's just not present. So in some ways, the sort of the fighting for the South Asian space, whatever that means, however you define it, whether it's Indian and Pakistani or and Bangladesh and Afghanistan, whatever that space is, almost seems to sort of dominate my experience rather than the sort of the aspect of being female within the scene. The agenda pushing because of people like Mrs. Hashmi of a generation before us who've sort of carved out a space for being a woman in the art scene. The squabble, as it were, and I can't help using slightly conflict, words to do with conflict, because it is a conflicted space, is really now to carve out a space that allows for South Asian art history to be part and discussed, whatever its dynamics are. And sort of leading into that, one of the things that I find very interesting is the extent to which in mainstream art history departments that you know, have these narratives about what art history means, there's always and invariably a sort of feminist theory course, and it really strikes one how different, in fact, the South Asian experience is in terms of you know, artists working, female artists working on feminist issues within that. And I think this is something Mrs. Hashmi has said quite a lot in different forums, but including on the sort of lecture she gave for my BNU course, where in fact the trajectory of South Asian women artists is different. They also play a much bigger part in the formulation of a critical debate and sort of undercutting a lot of sort of masculinist principles of art, of you know, the kind of the sort of macho art world. Sometimes, well, like Shaz Sikandar, in an extremely, that's very obvious what she's doing. But I mean, and you see that in Pakistan, but you also see that a lot in India, in the kind of sort of the play with being female. Somebody like Anju Dodia, who, like, you know, sort of puts herself into the frame in different ways. Someone like Bharti Kher, who uses bindis and pink. You know, Rana, who one can't help noticing the way in which you sort of use a language of sort of American modernist minimalism and like sort of inflecting it with color and, you know, doing things that are kind of yeah. And so there's I think there's a very rich space of looking at sort of art history, then looking at how South Asian art history fits into that, and then making an argument that in fact quite a lot of our assumptions about both South Asia and art history are contested through the work of women artists.
Right. And so you have this constant kind of jostling between something that's on the periphery and something that should be central. And I guess that's what we're all trying to debate and bring more awareness to, in terms of how that art history has been taught, how it hasn't been taught, how it's been completely ignored, quite frankly, and how it should be more embedded and centralized in a lot of subjects, and in practical subjects as well. Certainly from my own experience, anything to do with creativity and the arts was regarded as a hobby. And it wasn't until I was much older that I had the confidence to kind of forge my own path in the creative arts. So yes, I think there is a double frame that South Asian women, or women artists from the other parts of non-Western countries, have to negotiate constantly, which leads me to Lita and your incredible journey into the arts. Now, as I understand it, you've had this extraordinary, almost nomadic lifestyle, and you've ended up living in glorious sunny California. And I just wondered if you could give us your insight into, and share some of your journey into how you've negotiated your position as a woman in the arts, and coming from North Africa and living in a country and being brought up in a country and a culture that is divorced from your roots, and whether you could tell us about your experience.
Okay, thank you, Uthra. First of all, I want to thank you for including me in this panel, which is wonderful that we span the globe. And I'm delighted to participate. And also, I have been known as an American artist, and to the last couple of weeks, I've been in other panels where Southeast Asia, the Middle East, where my roots is coming up, which I'm delighted. And I also want to say that I'm really excited that it is Women's History Month, and that I also launched my website the first day. And so being a woman And I have to say that my story starts with my grandmother, who was a singer of classical Arabic music from Andalusia. And she had her own orchestra, would go from Tunisia to Vienna to record. So that was very unusual. She was born in the 1890s. And then my mother was, she was a real revolutionary. I would say I would not be where I am without her. She was a playwright. And when she was 20, she went to, and this is in 1930, she went to Paris and tried to get her play produced. And of course she couldn't. She was a woman. Nobody paid attention to her. So her pen name became a man's name, and she pretended she was an assistant to an old man, and she was taking the play around. And then it got accepted, it got produced, and they found out she was a woman, and it was great, and she got rave reviews. So I stand on her shoulders. Then in the 30s, she came to America, and she was going around the world, and ended up in Hollywood and fell in love with Hollywood as a playwright, and decided she would do anything to come back. So she then does come back. It's a long, long story, but then I was born in the US, but grew up entirely in Tunisia, in North Africa. And I grew up in a Catholic convent in Carthage, being of Jewish origin in an Islamic country. I would say that one of my biggest influences in my art is Islamic art. I love everything about it. Talk about Rana's work and light. And so when I came to this country, I was 11 and very shy, and started out as a poet. And then I thought I would go into theater. And then I did end up in the visual arts. And I started with the light and space movement in Los Angeles, which was very much a boys' club. And so that was, but somehow I was able to put my foot in the door and started doing things, not only light space, but also land art. And I was accepted. Now, it's not the same as being a male artist in terms of complete recognition within the canon. But it's been an extraordinary journey. And I feel that there's, even though there are inequities, absolutely, I feel that I really have a voice, and I'm able to express it. And it's quite a freedom. When I think I told Uthra the beginning, when I started out in university in philosophy, and then I wanted to be a writer. So I went into French, and then I went to English, but I found out that all my friends were artists. But I couldn't be I didn't think I could be an artist, because an artist meant total freedom, and America was total freedom. And so I went into art history. And then of course I couldn't, I just had to, I started expressing myself and never stopped from there.
That's an incredible story, Lita. And I feel like we could do a whole talk show on each of you, but because there's so much to unpack there. So I just wanted to ask you, so there are two things that have come up out of all of your discussions and insights. I wanted to ask you about how important is language for women in negotiating this space, because we've all come from countries and cultures and families where English hasn't necessarily been the language spoken at home, or it's regarded as the language of education, if you like, that people have had to learn through in higher education. And I just wondered to what extent language has played a role in all of you negotiating your careers, and whether that was something you had to consciously take on board, or whether it was something that was part of your education that you happily embraced. Rana, perhaps I could start with you.
I think for me, I think I learnt the hard way, really. I realized that it wasn't, art wasn't something that I could easily kind of just dive into and do what I want. I needed to kind of find a way where I could still kind of respect the values and the traditions that was being, really my family were trying to kind of keep hold of, but at the same time I was trying to kind of I guess grow in another culture and develop an identity and a career. And it was I really struggled. I mean, one of the way for me was just being able to do it through my work, through that kind of visual language, and not being able to have the words was difficult. So I definitely used my work to kind of express what I was kind of striving for. I don't know if that's
really interesting. Mrs. Hashmi, can I just ask you about the impact of English as a language for learning about the arts and learning of the arts and people in art education? How important was that at that time when you were setting up and involved in all these faculty positions?
Well, it has been, as you mentioned before, English is the language of education. And so therefore, you're tremendously hampered because the vast majority of one's students, 90% of them, were not comfortable in English because they came from all parts of the country. They very often came from underprivileged backgrounds where they didn't have access to English language teaching. They struggled to get into college because of not having had that start in life to do with English. And then, of course, all the writing is in English. There's very little writing in Urdu, or of course, even less in the regional languages on the arts. And so much of what you gather around these cultures is primarily oral culture. So all the storytelling, all the oral poetry, all of that is in either the regional language or it's in Urdu. And there you're encountering the formal classroom in which it all suddenly switches to English. And I tried very hard always to be bilingual because I felt, that was required. And I found that I could make up words actually as I went along. To deal with situations or to deal with phenomena or demonstrating things, because as Rana said, there's the third language, there's the visual language. And, a bit of show and tell business going on in the studio. And one found that students very quickly overcame that gap. Yes, there was the anxiety that they needed the spoken language if they are to talk about what they've done. But I think that trying to keep it as informal as possible, which was part of my strategy, was always the best thing. But I myself struggled with language because in our household, my father being a poet and a very distinguished poet meant that Urdu was, the heavy in the household. And therefore, trying to negotiate that and with a mother who was English and who had promised herself that her children's first language would not be English. So I didn't know any English until about I was 6. So, that language was always something which was a contested space within the house and in teaching. And then when I went to England to study, I missed Urdu like anything because I was, out in the Bath Academy of Art at Corsham. And for months at that time, there was not a large diaspora at all. So for months, I used to talk to myself, And I used to get
Will do.
newspapers. By email, I used to get newspapers, and I used to be reading like 3-month-old news in Urdu. But so, and I also did eventually ended the Urdu service in London doing a children's program just to keep. So I think language is something which can be so oppressive that then the visual takes on that sort of very warm, enveloping feeling for you.
Yeah.
And you can live within it.
Yeah.
And
it has the visual language has this great way of connecting all languages of the world. And certainly, when I was growing up, the main language that was spoken in our house was Tamil. And in this country, in the UK, most of the South Asian population speak Punjabi, Gujarati, Urdu. So, if I typically met other South Asian people, as I did back in the day when I was doing my first degree in law, and they'd say, well, what language do you speak? And I'd say, well, kind of Tamil. And they'd say, what's that? So, it's interesting that we all have these experiences of language in our upbringing, and how we've had to kind of, take these on board. They very much become part of our identities. Before I go to Zehra and Lita, Rana, did you want to come?
Well, it just brought up this kind of time when I came to the UK without any English, and I was at school and not being able to communicate, Salima. So I kind of it kind of just brought that up for me. And I remember actually really struggling to communicate. And so I spent days, I was given lots of paper and coloring pencils and pens. And so I spent days just kind of drawing, and most of what I was drawing was images from Bangladesh, how my life was in Bangladesh growing up. And that's how I was able to communicate. So I absolutely kind of stand by my thing, which that I was using a visual language to kind of communicate, because I didn't have the words, I didn't have the language. I didn't know how else I could do that. And it became that, through those images, I was able to connect to my peers in the classroom and the teachers. And I think that still has had a massive impact, so a lot of my work now, I really like to not have any text with it, or even titles, because I feel like it's the visual experience that I want people to kind of, see first, or have first with the work.
And very much that immersive experience as well, that from your work as well, when I encounter it, if I can put it that way. Lisa, can I just ask, having traveled and have had the experience and having absorbed so many languages and cultures, how have you manifested those different aspects through your work? And have you been consciously aware of thinking in one language, or writing and reading in another, or dreaming in one language and working in another, or that all just melted into one big, lovely, squidgy pot?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
I wasn't sure if you said. It was a big thing. I didn't know a word of English when I came to this country, but since we had come to this country, I had to learn. But it was I had such a poetic desire to express myself in French. I didn't know English, and we spoke French in the house, and obviously I had to communicate, and I learned rather quickly. I understood more than I could speak, but it's always been, the subtleties, as you all know, all the different languages. There's no way you can translate. And I just found an extraordinary piece of writing that my mother had done in 1934 in French. And it was just so, it's just delicious. And I mean, I admire translators who can do that. So in terms of, for me, it's always been this going from visual from writing to text to visual, back and forth. My work always starts with writing. Which is really interesting. I used to paint. I start with writing, automatic writing in the paintings. The last few years, I've developed a narrative very specifically that is then going into all these different installations and films and sculptures. I just did a project for Desert X in Saudi Arabia of a figurative female sculpture who is part of my narrative. She's a 25th century female astronaut who comes to this planet to teach our relationship to the stars. And so she's sitting on top of a boulder in this massive, beautiful canyon in the desert. And the 2 miles long valley, I have put powder blue pigment aligned to the stars. So she is here spreading that word in an Islamic country, doing figurative work. But coming in through the language. So it's always been this really interesting back and forth of language and not. And now, I used to dream in French. I used to think in French. I still count in French. But I do read, but it's in terms of like describing my work, it's a lot easier in English for me now.
Right.
But the language, it's vital, to all of us. And it's the beginning of who we are, our first language, our maternal language. Yeah. And that's probably why I did go into the visual arts.
Very, very, very interesting. And what a lovely picture you've just painted in everyone's minds of the work that you're currently doing. So Zehra, I just wanted to ask, given that we have all these complexities around language, we all try and negotiate them, work out what we're trying to say, never mind communicating that through art. How on earth do we teach that in art history? And how do we capture those nuances and slippages that somehow can never be translated into words? How do we begin to even teach this stuff?
Well, I guess by just sort of acknowledging that there is a sort of untranslatable complexity to it, and my particular angle into this is actually a very personal one, which is not usually my angle into anything, but is the fact that my main language is ironically English. So I mean, I can't even conceive of dreaming or thinking in anything else. And I realize that this is in some ways it gives me an advantage, and in other ways it makes me incredibly insensitive to a kind of visual dialogue that isn't already embedded in art historical discourse. And in some ways, a lot of contemporary art is very biased towards language and towards English and towards the very structures in which we sort of think about visuality and how it should be expressed, is already embedded in a kind of conceptual structure. And I do feel that is, I realize that it is rather unfair for artists who do have different languages that they're operating in. And, that quality of untranslatability, while one can say that, one has to be aware of it, and it's always there as a dynamic. But the people who sort of get the most prominence are those who can articulate that untranslatability in English. And in a really good example of that, both the sort of pain of the relatability, as well as the ability to master vocabulary of that, is someone like Zarina Hashmi, who's who talks constantly in her work about ideas of home being foreign, about the idea of her language being a home that is foreign, of the loss of Urdu for her. And yet, if you sort of follow the trajectory of her oeuvre, part of the reason that she is so iconic is because all of these, themes were actually articulated very well within an English system of crossing both academia as well as American art history. So we do have a paradox that, even as we're aware that there's a problem here, the way of dealing with that problem ultimately gives all voice to those who can manipulate English the best. And yeah, so.
I just wonder, in the last 10 minutes or so of our talk, if we could reflect a little bit on how the pandemic has changed the way we connect and appreciate these artists. We've talked about our own journeys, negotiating different languages, and we've also talked about the dominance of English and English, in the published text. And how do you think the pandemic could help us to connect with those artists who don't have English as a first language and who want to be heard and seen? And and particularly the women artists, we know so many women artists, and from my own area of specialism in textiles, that a lot of formal education has been denied to them, and so they've had to start doing these things in a kind of secretive way in their own bedrooms or in their own times, and try and juggle all these things with family life and parents and all of that. So if we had to think about how the pandemic has made us all pause and reflect on how we can work better and connect with each other better, I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts about that in the last few minutes, how we can reach out to those artists who have yet to be seen, heard, discovered. Mrs. Hashmi?
Well, it just reminds me of, it's so strange that you said that, because there's a former student of mine, Sarah Ahmed, who lives in the US, and she's on a sort of long residency. And part of the work that she wanted to do, she wanted in this wilderness, in this time, which has been so difficult for people, to bring up, to have marigolds, which are so joyful. So she happened to be in Lahore, her father was sick, she came, and she said to me that, when I order fresh marigolds to arrive, in the US on a particular date, it's a bit of a long shot that. So we thought about, why not marigolds made with fabric and with paper? And I connected her to a group of actually who works with women artisans, who, as you can imagine, during this pandemic, have really lost their livelihood. And it was tremendous to see what they produced and, how we managed to get it done on time and packed off to the US. And I thought, these connections between the artist who manages to see how the artisan can be so much part of their vision if they think about it. And she just sent me, she's yet to install that work. And I looked at that glorious color, against those bare branches. And I thought, this, and there's a tent there also, which is to do with the race riots in the last century. And it tied up the possible connections that the artist and the artisan, especially the women, could make. And the fact that you had an example done right in the pandemic, and an example that to me was the beginning, the kernel of perhaps a rethinking about how we can look at our practices, and how they can be collaborative practices which are stretched, across our immediate world and go into other worlds.
Well,
So yes, I think it's possible if we seriously think about working together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lita?
Mrs. Hashmi,
I was going to ask, then are you also saying that, part of the way to sort of resolve this dynamic, not resolve, but at least sort of redress it, is if artists not just acknowledge their assistants, but actually made them as part of their practice. Someone like Kadam Ali saying, oh, I want share on everything with me because he is also my collaborator. And that sort of dynamic that you don't, as an artist, it doesn't have to play the sort of the middleman all the time in terms of visual language, but to say actually there's another thing happening here, and I have a collaborator, and they too have a voice.
Yes. Sorry, before you come back to that, Lita, I think you just wanted to add something as well.
I just think, Mrs. Hashmi and both Zehra, that it's a brilliant thought. I was just recently wanting to do a list of all the people I've collaborated with, big and small, and it's endless. And to bring them in this manner is absolutely brilliant. When I was in Saudi Arabia, two artists, one Saudi Arabian artist, Manal, and Shirin Gurkis from Egypt, put together a workshop for young women who wanted to be artists. They were from the village, and it was phenomenal. I mean, I didn't speak Arabic, but they were all, and it was to engage others. I think this is the century of the collective, right? We all know, I mean, look at us right here, and we're together, and the pandemic has brought us together. How could we do this without the pandemic, really? So it is an extraordinary moment, and to include all, we are in this moment where the old story is no longer viable. We're starting the new story of us and the cosmos. And what that means is that there's this incredible diversity. We are all expressing ourselves. And through that, we're interconnected. And to bring them all out, all the marigolds, all of the people is beautiful. So thank you. Thank you. It's really, got it. An idea for a next project.
Brilliant.
I am doing.
Yeah, I think for me, the pandemic has really highlighted, a lot of the issues that are kind of, whether it's race, inequality, and gender, all of those things. It's definitely allowed people to kind of take some time and think about the things that are happening, whether it's politically or locally or internationally. What this is, not only is it giving us time to kind of think, but also giving us ways to kind of to figure out ways to kind of make it work and make it, make things better. And I think I feel like that's definitely something that's made me think about, the way I work, how I want to continue working, and how I want to continue working internationally as well. And without having a massive impact on the environment, and how you can still continue to have conversations. I mean, this is definitely like, you're saying, Lita, that it's definitely an example of how it can be done and how we can still kind of develop. You're not isolated. And I think what's important to remember is that, we're kind of really fortunate to be living at a time where you can still connect with people, and you can still kind of, even whether you have the education or don't have the education, if it is the arts that you want to continue and be in, then there are definitely ways for you to kind of be out there and be exposed, or expose your work internationally. It's no longer limited to the elites, if you like. It's no longer limited to the people that only have the contacts. And I think that's what it's important, is that language is a barrier, and it can be a barrier for even those people that have the education. But there are ways of getting around it. And I
think that's a really good note to kind of wrap up our conversation. I feel like we could continue to talk for quite a long time, because I feel like we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg with some of the issues we started to unpack. And I know there were other things that we wanted to discuss, but sadly we're out of time. So I just wanted to thank once again all of the panelists for joining us from across the world today. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your commitment to this event and to Bangladesh Art Week. And of course, thank you to Niharika. Without Niharika's vision and prompting and contacting, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't have been brought together. So I want to say a huge thank you for all your organization and all the team behind you who runs around frantically, because we all rely on people, don't we? So thank you to all of them as well. And also, I just wanted to say to anybody listening to this program, if you're thinking about a career in the arts, like Rana said, please do go forth, don't hesitate. It's a wonderfully rich career that will open up so many doors to you. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.